Why do people misunderstand each other? Mr. Lee.
When we met last time in my previous session, I ended the session with a bit of a problem, and I'd like to repeat it again. If I were to come up to you and were to say something like this, I want to tell you something about a young lady named Mary. Now, Mary was a sensible and giddy young lady, wise and silly beyond compare. She was a slight and small creature, yet so large that everybody who knew her loved her. She felt rather lonely because she lived in a town with no other houses or people for miles around. What would be your reaction? What would be the momentary, automatic response you would be likely to give? We've asked several thousand people this very same question with this kind of example. This is a very simple one. And one can catalog and classify the kinds of responses. Now, I haven't time to describe all of the varieties, but they range between those people who dismiss the speaker. They say, oh, he's all mixed up. He's contradictory. He's talking nonsense. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know the meanings of words. He's all mixed up. And sometimes they're a little bit less complimentary than that. And then they range all the way down to another category, at the very far end, when people have, as it were, a mood of inquiry. They don't dismiss, but they say, well, now, whatever are you trying to say? What are you after? What are you trying to get across to me? Say it in other words so that I don't misunderstand you. Now, between these two poles of dismissal and inquiry, there are a number of other possibilities, but they are by no means important, because these are the two I should like to focus on. And I might just say at the moment, if you dismiss me, if I come up to you in a hurried situation and say Mary was a sensible and giddy young lady, and you tell me that I'm mixed up, contradictory, my normal reaction is not necessarily to think that you're being friendly or you're being too wise yourself. So that there are some very interesting human dynamic interrelationships that come whenever someone dismisses someone else. And I should like to talk about this phenomenon of dismissal as it relates to the larger problem of understanding and misunderstanding in my remaining session today. Now, I should like to approach an attempt to deal with this kind of difficulty, but perhaps by beginning technically. I'd like to ask you to think with me a little bit about what we know about words. What are some of the most obvious, well-organized, well-agreed-upon characteristics of a language, whether it's English or any other? Well, I can run them down into a series of numbers. Let me begin. In the first place, we can make a distinction between technical terms and non-technical terms. Now, by the technical terms, I mean all those words used in any specialized area in chemistry, physics, TV, the law, and elsewhere, where the range of use of a word will be very narrow. Thus, for example, if I ask for sodium biosulfite, if there's such a thing, in a drugstore in New York City or in San Diego, I'm very likely to get the very same thing. That is, sodium biosulfite is a word with very narrow, limited uses. It's a technical term. We've stipulated, we've decided that the word will have that usage and not very many others. And in the law, there are hundreds of such terms, and in engineering and electricity and physics and so on and so on. But it isn't those words I'm interested in. I'm interested in the hundreds of thousands of others which are the non-technical terms. Now, the non-technical terms are all those that I will be using most of the time in this talk today. They are the words like run and talk and how and feel. That is all of the words which we will be using 95%, or it's almost 99% of our talking time. Now, the peculiar and interesting thing about these words is, take, for example, the word run. Well, it will have many uses. I can talk about running a race or running a mile or home run or sheep run or something having to do with a little boy's nose or colors running or run on a bank or run in a stocking. And each one of these uses is quite different. And the range, we will say, of the uses of the word run will be very broad, whereas the range of a technical term like electron might be very much narrower. Well, that's the first thing we know, that many, many words. Take the word strike, for example. It's used in baseball to miss, in fishing to hit, in labor activities to go away from, in boxing to hit, and so on and so on. The word fast, sometimes in the sense of going in a great rush. Sometimes when we talk about a fast color, we mean staying put in one place. So my first characteristic, that is the first point. Words may be used in a narrow or wide range, depending. Second thing we know that there are tremendous regional variations in the uses of words. That a word will be used in one part of the country in one way and in another part of the country in another way. I was in a meeting in San Francisco some time back, and in the middle of the morning, our chairman looked up and said, well, I think we've gone far enough. Why don't we interrupt this and go out and have some coffee and snails? And my first impulse was to say, isn't it a little early for that sort of thing? Well, snails in San Francisco, when you ask for them, you get something quite different from what you will get, say, if you ask for them in Chicago. A snail in San Francisco is a wound-up sweet roll that looks very much like a snail. I was in Montgomery, Alabama some time ago and talked to a friend of mine who turned to me and said, when the meeting is over, I'll carry you to town. And my first impulse was to say, thanks very much, but can't I go on my own theme? But carry you to town, for him, merely meant the fact that he was offering me a ride in his car. And thus, there are regional variations that occur, and perhaps you can think of some in usage. Of course, some of the greatest differences occur between usage in this country and in England. If you travel to Great Britain, for example, you'll readily discover this tremendous variation. In England, for example, a dessert is a sweet. The waitress will ask you, will you have, what kind of sweet will you have? A cop is very rarely he's a bobby. Garters are suspenders. If you ask for suspenders, you will not get what you're likely to get in a store in this country. Suspenders there are braces. Bloody, I might say, is a curse word in England and is very rarely used in polite company. Taffy is toffee. Syrup is treacle. You have cakes with treacle. Soft drinks are minerals. Think of the range of words we have to talk about soft drinks in this country. A rumble seat is a dicky. The second floor is the first floor. When someone lives on the first floor, you have to climb up. A roller coaster is a switchback railway, and so on and so on. That is, one of the very readily recognized things is that words in different parts of the country, and even in different jobs, a man in the printing business, or in the carpentry business, or the TV business, will begin to develop a bunch of words that he will use in his own way. A dolly in the TV jargon is not exactly what it will be to a little girl going into the 10-cent store. That is, there's a range of uses, and we're accustomed to that. And, of course, a third thing that we know about words, and that is that words change historically. A word, when Chaucer, for example, talked of having in one of the tales of someone having been to a solemn party, he did not mean the kind of party that we would think he meant. A solemn party for him was one that ended in a drunken brawl. It was a party which became solemn. For us, the usage is quite different. Think, for example, of the changes in possible uses. Just a few centuries ago, when Middle English was spoken, King James once referred to St. Paul's Cathedral as amusing, awful, and artificial. Now, if someone were to call a creation of yours amusing, awful, and artificial, or of mine, I should be disposed not to think too highly of it. But then, that statement was a rare compliment. King James meant that for amusing, he meant amazing. Awful, he used in the sense of awe-inspiring, and artificial, by the word artificial, he meant artistic. And thus he was paying a rare compliment in words which, if used by one of us probably today, would be a rather derogatory kind of insult. Think also of the history of the changes of the uses of words. The word cowboy. The Dictionary of American English gives countless numbers of these fascinating stories, but the word cowboy is of some interest. This was not originally a Western word at all. Before the days of dude ranches, this word was used in an utterly different sense. Indeed, it was an Eastern word used to describe George III's fifth column in the American colonies. The cowboys of the last quarter of the 18th century were Tory sympathizers who wandered through the woods at night ringing cowbells. Unsuspecting American patriots hearing the tinkle would sally forth with lanterns in search of the straying bossies and bessies supposedly attached to the bells and were promptly blitzkrieged by enemy blunderbusses. Now, the cowboy was a Tory fifth columnist, a quisling, a person who sold out. And then one can find some other characteristics of the language. Another one of the characteristics that we're thoroughly aware of is the continuous coinage of new words. That is, in our society, English is growing at a tremendous pace. And the history of the development and creation of new words is an extremely interesting study, of which I can merely touch on at the moment. John Milton, for example, was a famous coiner of words. By the way, the technical word for a word which is coined is a neologism. And most students of language will think of the word neologism in fairly much the same way. But here are some of the words that Milton coined: dimensionless, infinitude, emblazonry, bannered, anarch, satanic, echoing, irradiant, pandemonium. Mark Twain in this country was a prolific coiner of words. Those of you interested in poker may or may not recognize that Mark Twain coined many of the phrases that will be used. Words like passing the buck, four-flushing, sitting pretty, and New Deal. That word New Deal was not one that was coined in the 30s. Indeed, General Sherman back in 1863 once said, "Charleston is not taken, the war is prolonged, and but little chance of its ending until we have a New Deal." That's another one of the characteristics. And incidentally, our dictionaries are hard put to keep up. Think of these words which are only in the most recently published American College Dictionary: super bomb, beanie, canasta, quickie, do-gooder, MC, formica, gin rummy, gobbledygook, hassle, Israeli, king size, Orlan, motel, pollster, and so on. Words which we continuously make up, and that's something I think one ought to think about. And finally, the last of the characteristics of English that I should like to talk about, of course the list is very much longer, is the fact that in English we know how to make differences in tone in our expression. Now, by tone, I don't mean melody. I mean the status of our talk. For example, I have a friend whose daughter was being married recently, and he knew me well enough. He could have called me up to say, "Hey, Lee, why don't you come Saturday to see my kid get hitched?" But no, he didn't do that. He sent me a very handsomely engraved statement on vellum in which he said, "Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so request the pleasure of your attendance at the nuptials of their daughter, Susan Ann." Now, the difference between these two is one of tone. It isn't one of meaning. The intention may be exactly the same in both cases, but there's a difference in tone. One is not likely in certain circumstances to use certain kinds of words. Thus, for example, I might mean exactly the same thing if I asked you to put out the lights, or douse the glim, or terminate the illumination. That is, these phrases are interchangeable, but I'm not likely to use douse the glim in a studio or in Washington during the war if I wanted somebody to be sure that the lights were turned out. Or I might say, for example, I beat it to the door, I hastily quitted the room, I retired precipitately. I would probably do exactly the same thing, but these statements or phrases are ways of talking about what I did with more or less differences in tone or status. Now then, what does this all mean? What does it mean to say that we continually create words, that words change historically, that words mean different things at different periods? I think it means only that if we are aware of some of the things we know about language, our attitudes towards it might be somewhat more flexible, somewhat less inclined to believe that words are fixed and remain fixed all the time, that words change. They're used differently in different places. Now, this is very old stuff, but we tend somehow to forget it. We tend to forget in the hurry of our talking that words are used in all sorts of ways quite differently. Now, you remember what I said about Mary, if I may go back for the moment. I said Mary was a sensible and giddy young lady. Now, that looks like a contradiction. But if I might explain the kind of ornery stunt that I did, I might say that the word giddy I was using in a very older sense. If you notice it, or spell it out in your mind, you'll notice that it looks very much like godly. And it comes, by the way, from the same stem as God, and used to mean divinely possessed, enthusiastic, and no sense of dizziness or foolishness. And may I say, suppose I was using it in that sense, and I merely meant Mary was a sensible and enthusiastic young lady, wise and silly beyond compare. Now, the word silly comes from that German. The word selig means blessed or happy. And of course, as the word language developed, the word came to be used in a satirical sense. According to that wise old philosopher Solon, no man had a right to call himself happy until he was dead. So that accordingly, he who regarded himself as blessed was a fool. In other words, I was using that, and she was a Wise and happy, she was a slight and small creature. Now, would you play the game? She was a slight and small creature, yet so large. Might I mean something besides big? Yes, because the word large, for a very long time in the history, was used in the sense of generous. We even talk about a person with a large heart. Now, please observe something in the communication situation. Here is a speaker who mentions some words, and here is a listener. Now, there are two things that a listener can do. The listener can interpret the words as he would use them were he doing the talking. Or, and let's call that mode A, or the listener could attempt to interpret the words as the speaker meant them. To put it another way, one of our important difficulties in communication, I believe, arises because listeners tend to do A and never to mind B. Listeners tend to worry about what words mean rather than what the speaker means. We tend to be so taken and so hypnotized by the word itself that we pay no attention to what the speaker means. Now, it might well be that you would think that I was foolish or unwise to use words this way. That's possible, and I shouldn't deny that possible opinion. Nevertheless, when you say I was contradicting myself, you were looking at the meaning of the word giddy as you would be likely to use it. And thus we have a word we call bypassing. I may have been using the word in one way. You proceeded to interpret it another way. And thus we talk past each other. And we find that very, very often listeners tend to believe that speakers are using words as the listener would were the listener doing the talking. And if as a listener you attempt to look at the word apart from me, there is the danger that we will misunderstand each other. Now, sometimes the misunderstanding is frivolous and doesn't mean very much. In Cleveland, Robert Harris, 40, a handyman, was found guilty in traffic court of driving while drunk. $100 in costs, intoned Judge Perry Fry, to be executed by July 2nd. My God, Judge, exclaimed Harris, fainting dead away. When Harris was revived, Judge Fry explained that he was using the word executed as a technical legal term, and he merely meant that Harris had until July 2nd to pay the fine. Here is Harris interpreting the word execute in his way, which is all right. But if you do A without regard for the speaker, then we talk past each other. And sometimes there are the occasions in which this happens are quite frivolous. In New Mexico, when an airline hostess passed out chewing gum with the routine instruction for the ears, a lady passenger later complained, it worked all right, but couldn't you use something not so sticky? Well, what does for the ears mean? I should now like to say that that question is of lesser importance to us than what did the young lady mean? To ask the question, what did the word mean, is to put the emphasis on the wrong place in the communication line. I would like to draw another picture. I would like to draw a picture in which listeners are interested in what speakers mean and speakers speak to listeners, rather than someone talking to the word. Of course, sometimes this is very difficult and sometimes exceedingly embarrassing. There is a story that came out of the World War, the Second World War. The Army wanted to establish the newspaper Stars and Stripes in Europe, and found a young man named Sergeant Bill E., who was in the Corps of Engineers, and assigned him to the daily newspaper because on his classification card there was recorded his previous experience as the proprietor of a book establishment in Syracuse, New York. Now, it wasn't until several months later that somebody discovered that Sergeant E.'s book establishment didn't deal in fiction and nonfiction, it booked bets on the horses. Now, what does the phrase mean, proprietor of a book establishment? I should like to suggest that that's not as important a question as what did he mean. Now, there is a tremendous qualitative difference between two people talking. If a listener proceeds to say you use words and they're mixed up, you don't know what you're talking about. The mood is then one of enmity. The mood is one of distance. I should like to develop that kind of human sympathy in which a man would be more moved to wonder, what do you suppose he means? What do you mean? And sometimes I've talked about these in unimportant situations, trivial, frivolous. Sometimes the consequences are far more devastating. Two examples. One from a biography by David Shub of Lenin. On December the 20th, 1917, Lenin instructed Felix Dzerzhinsky to organize an extraordinary commission for combating counter-revolution and speculation. Dzerzhinsky became the first head of this Soviet secret police. Organized systematic mass terror was the instrument used by the Chekhovs. At meetings of this very high Soviet body, Lenin often exchanged notes with his colleagues. On one occasion, he sent a note to Dzerzhinsky. How many vicious counter-revolutionaries are there in our prisons? Dzerzhinsky's reply was about 1,500. Lenin read it, snorted something to himself, made a cross beside the figure, and returned the note to D. D rose and left the room without a word. No one paid any attention either to Lenin's note or to D's departure. The meeting continued. But the next day, there was excited whispering. D had ordered the execution of all the 1,500 vicious counter-revolutionaries. The previous night, immediately after leaving the room, he had taken Lenin's cross as a collective death sentence. There would have been little comment had Lenin's gesture been meant as an order for wholesale liquidation. But as Potyeva, Lenin's secretary, explained, there was a misunderstanding. Lenin never wanted these executions. Dzerzhinsky simply didn't understand him. Lenin usually puts a cross on memoranda to indicate that he has read them and noted their contents. Well, an occasion in which 1,500 men are destroyed because someone presumes that X means something. Now, words don't mean, only a person does. There is no meaning in a word. We sometimes talk about this as the container myth. Now, you can put something in a glass, water, dirt, sand, anything. A glass will hold something. And we can talk about this as a container. A word, however, is not a container in the way a glass is. The container of meaning is a man, a woman, it's you. It's you listening, it is I talking, it is I listening, it is you talking. A word doesn't mean for Dzerzhinsky to look at X and act as if that meant wipe him out. That is to look, incidentally, to think of how many different ways we use the word X in our society. X marks the spot. X is sometimes the signature of a man who can't write his name. X is at the bottom of a letter, a number of X's, an indication of goodwill and friendliness. That is, the word X doesn't mean anything, but in our approach to language, we have a tendency to think that a word is a self-containing center of meaning. It isn't. Words are sounds in the air, marks on the blackboard. Meaning is in you and in me. And thus, when Dzerzhinsky proceeds to respond to the X, he behaves in the mood A. He pays no attention to what the speaker may mean. Another illustration, which perhaps comes slightly more closely to our time. This appears in Secretary James Burns' book, Speaking Frankly. In a private conversation with Mr. Molotov, he says, it became apparent that another difficult problem had arisen between ourselves and the Russians. At the San Francisco conference, when the question of establishing a trusteeship system within the UN was being considered, the Soviet delegation has asked Mr. Stettinius what the American attitude would be toward the assumption by the Soviet Union of a trusteeship. Mr. Stettinius replied in general terms, expressing the opinion that the Soviet Union was eligible to receive a territory for administration under trusteeship. Mr. Molotov took this to mean that the U.S. would support a Soviet request for a trusteeship. Now, what does the word eligible mean? To me, that question isn't entirely sensible. What did Mr. Stettinius mean? Now, sometimes we use the word eligible. I suppose any of us is eligible to try out if you're an American citizen for the Olympic track team. But that doesn't mean you will get a place on the team. When Mr. Molotov asked, was the Soviet Union eligible? Mr. Stettinius replied, yes, you're eligible to ask for it, but that doesn't mean we'll get it. And then several months later, when it came to a vote, the United States voted against, giving the Russians one of the trusteeships, whereupon Mr. Molotov's equal proceeded to arise and speak devastatingly about the United States' refusal to honor its promises and obligations. And I should suggest that it makes a difference what a man means, far more than that we pay attention to the words. In practice, this means a great deal. In our studies of the behavior and relationship between parents and children try to say things. And parents sometimes in a hurry impatient, proceed to dismiss them. We urge a very interesting kind of delay. We urge patience, an attempt to discover what is on his mind. Incidentally, we've come to a quite different attitude about what we mean by a boner. We find very few boners nowadays. For example, a teacher in the classroom, let's say in the civics class, the teacher says, "Who officiates when the president dies?" And Johnny in the 5th or 6th row raises his hand and says, "The Undertaker." And the teacher proceeds to bawl him out. Now, that may be a boner from one point of view. From another point of view, Johnny interpreted his way. The teacher was interpreting it her way. And somewhere in the educational training, growth programs of young and old people, I should think it would be of enormous value if somewhere we got a sharp sensitivity of the fact that if we would understand a man, we must go way beyond his words. It becomes necessary to await patiently, to wonder what he means. Normally, if there is misunderstanding, we tend to blame the speaker. We tend to say he should have spoken more plainly. I now have come to believe that it is exceedingly difficult, no matter how simply a man speaks, for him to be misunderstood unless listeners seek to understand him. Incidentally, there is a game that can be played. We do not have time to play it in this session, and perhaps in the others, but it merely is this. If I want to misunderstand you, there is no set of instructions that you can give me that possibly can keep me from it. If I proceed to interpret your words in my way, it is very exceedingly difficult for you to do anything about it. And thus, we come finally to that tremendous conclusion that communication is a two-way process. It involves two people. Communication is not just one man talking. It is not one man listening. It involves two. And I suppose if we could come to any conclusion that makes more sense in the human communion process than any other, it is that it takes two to make communication. It takes a willing listener, and it takes a speaker eager to make himself understood. But in the hurry of the day, it is so easy for most of us to forget that as we pay too much attention to the words that we use.